Good evening, all of you. Good evening, all of you. Good evening. Okay. Good evening. So let's start. So in the last class, we were talking about Spring Framework. Now you know what is Spring Framework. It's a Java framework used for developing almost any type of application, and it is also an enterprise framework used for developing enterprise applications. So it greatly simplifies the development of enterprise applications. Now, uh, we have also discussed about the key strategies which are implied by the Spring Framework. Now, first of all, the most important thing here, the dependency injection concept in Spring Framework, as I told you people. When I say dependency injection, what does it means? What did I say dependency injection means?
Providing the dependencies which are needed for a particular bean.
So providing the dependencies which are needed for a particular bean. So what are dependencies? What is a dependency?
It's an object which is needed for another object to accomplish a task or goal.
Yes. So dependency, yes, that's right. It's an object which is needed for another object to accomplish a task or a goal. So an object, you see, to accomplish a task or a goal, it may take the help of several other dependencies or many other dependencies. I think it can take the help of many other dependencies. It may need more than one dependency, one or more than one dependency. So in Spring Framework, the dependencies are supplied by whom? By the container, Spring container. So one of the important services which is provided here is dependency injection. One of the important services which is provided here is dependency injection. Okay, so in the last class, we also saw how to create a Spring project. Okay, now you see, so what you are looking at here is a spring bean. So what you're looking at here is actually a spring bean. So how can we say that this is a spring bean? You see that annotation which you got here at the rate component on top of the bean on top of the class bean class we have that annotation, right? So that itself will indicate that it is actually a spring bean. Okay, so what if it is a spring bean? What if this class is a spring bean class? What is special about this spring bean objects here? Very good. So life cycle of the spring bean is managed by the container, and what else? You will find that con- container also provides another service called as dependency injection. So which are very important features here of Spring Framework. Dependency injection in lifecycle management support. Okay. Now here, so one important thing about Spring Framework is we have a configuration file. So when we configure the details about the beans and all. As of now, here we have component scan element, which is used to specify where exactly we got the spring beans. Component scan annotation, it is actually used to specify where exactly we got this spring beans. Okay. So now in this case, it indicates that the spring beans are actually in the package called as com.ntc.app. So the container will check for that beans in that class. How the container will identify the beans? How the container will identify the bean? using that annotation. We got annotation here, right? At the rate. So when it comes across a class name at the rate component, it understands that basically it is a Spring Bean. The container can also configure an ID here for this bean. Say example source. You can configure an ID this way for a bean. Okay. Next, you know what? Here, let's do one thing. I would like to make use of this bean. I want to make use of this bean. We have that method over there, right? Get message. I want to call that get message method. I would like to call that get message method. I would like to make use of that method. So what to do? See here, first of all, you need to load the container because as I told you people, container is responsible for managing the life cycle of the beans. Container is responsible for managing the life cycle of the beans here. Okay? You see, in order to load the container, you have to write the following code here. Okay, let's do that. We'll define a class for this test. You see, this class now, which is known as class path application context, class path XML application context. So it is used to load the container, I can say. Basically, it is used to load the container. So, to this class constructor, we need to pass the configuration file name. Okay, we have to pass the configuration file name. So the configuration file is basically in that maintain folder, in a file folder called the Spring. The configuration file name is, sorry, just a second, app context.xml. app context of XML. So this is the configuration file. So you're passing that configuration file name to the Spring Framework here. Sorry, to the container. Because container is supposed to read that configurations. Who will use this configuration file? The container itself is responsible for that. Okay. So here, once the container is loaded successfully, we can ask the container to provide the bean reference. So we will not instantiate the beans here. Always we have to use we have to use this container. So call this containers method get bean and provide the bean ID. You can provide the class name also or provide the bean ID. Example service. You see, it will return the example service bean here. That's it. So this get bean method, what it does, it will call that. Sorry, get bean method will take that bean ID example service, and you see, it will search for that bean whose ID matches this bean ID and returns that bean reference. Okay, the container itself will instantiate that bean. Hello, can you people hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost the connection. Okay, so this example service which you got here, this bean, we are obtaining the bean reference. An application context is a reference variable which holds the reference to the class path XML application context object. Class path XML application context here. So it represents an object, okay, it represents that container. This class path XML context object, basically it represents that container. So now you'll get the bean reference. So let me call that method example service dot get message. So this get message method, what it does, it returns a message. We are trying to print it here using this println method. So whatever the message that method returns, we are trying to print it here. Yes. You see, you got that message, hello world. So container is returning that reference, that bean reference, so which we can make use of to call the methods of the bean or use that bean. Okay, so now you see, when you run this program, so what happens? Let me just explain it once. When you run this program, so main method will start execution, and this statement which you got here, it loads that Spring container. What it does basically, the statement wherein we are instantiating that class path XML object will load the container. It will load the container. And you see to this container we are passing the Spring Bean configuration file name. And once the container is loaded, you see that reference to the container, you will have it here in this application context variable. Okay. Now, if you want to request the container for a particular bean, you can use this get bean method. As I told you people, in Spring Framework, container itself is responsible for managing the life cycle of the beans, right? So we will not instantiate the bean classes directly. Instead, we'll ask the container to provide the bean reference. We'll ask the container to provide the bean reference here. So the container, what it does, it will return the bean reference. It will instantiate the bean, and it will return the bean reference. It will see. Yes. To this get bean method, we are passing the bean ID. Okay. So now, hope you people got it. Let's do one thing. We'll see how this dependency injection concept works. Let's see how this dependency injection concept works. As of now, you see this method which you got example service, what it is doing, it returns the get message method. It returns a message. That string message is actually hard coded here in this method itself. That message is basically hard coded here in this method itself. But let's say I want to read this message or fetch this message from the database server. Just assume that I want to fetch this message from the DB server, database server. Then what? So in order to interact with the database, now what we can do here, we can use a component called as DO, right? So let's do one thing. We'll try to develop a dumb DO, we can say. Okay, we'll try to develop a dumb DO. So new class. I'm trying to develop a dumb DO, means in that DO you will not have the code to really interact with the database server. So first of all, you see, let me define a class called as message DO. Here, in this DO class, let's define a method this way. Fetch message. So this method, what it does, so it returns a message. Okay. Okay. You see, just assume that here this method is interacting with the database server. It is fetching the message from the database server itself. Assume that this method is fetching the message from the database server. Okay. Okay. Just a second. Just a second. Here, let me do one thing. I will define an interface to define a contract for the DO class, iMessage DO, let's say. Actually, we have to define the interface first, but I'll do this here. That means what methods this method is supposed to implement. The details you see we have provided here in this interface now. And I'll make the class implements this interface. Interface is used to define a contract for the class, right? Okay. So now I want to make it a Spring Bean. So this is just a normal Java class now, right? How can we make it a Spring Bean?
By specifying @component annotation.
Yes. So we can use this annotation @component. And I'll configure an ID, let's say message to you. That's it. Now you see the examples. I want the example service method to use that message DO to fetch the message from the database server. Okay. I want example service to use that message DO to fetch the message from the database server, let's say. So how can we do that? You see, this is Spring Framework. Normally, if you want to use that message DO here in the example service, you will simply instantiate that message DO class and you'll call that method. Here it is Spring Framework. It works in a slightly different way. First of all, now the message DO is needed for the example service to fetch the message from the database server, right? That means what is message DO for example service?
Dependency.
Yes. So basically, message DO is a dependency here. It's a dependency. So if it is a dependency, then in the Spring framework, the container is supposed to provide the bean reference. in the Spring framework. Who's responsible for providing the bean reference? The container, right? Yes. So how can we ask the container to provide the bean reference or the dependency? How can we ask the container to provide the dependency? How will we specify the dependency details? That is what you need to understand. Yes. You know, first of all, what you need to do is declare a reference variable of that dependency type. You see, I'm declaring a reference variable here, and this reference variable is what type? That interface type, iMessageDO. You see that the messageDO class, our dependency class, our dependency implements this interface, right? It implements this interface. That's the reason why here what I did, I'm making this, I'm using that reference variable of interface type. So that messageDO class bean reference, bean object reference here, or bean reference I can say, it can be stored here in this reference variable of interface type because that class implements this interface. Okay. Now on top of this reference, you see which you got here, I'm adding an annotation again. So what is that annotation? You see, that annotation is @AutoWide. @AutoWide annotation, it indicates that we want the container to inject the dependency of that messageDO type. It means iMessageDO type. It means which implements the iMessageDO interface here. Any bean class which implements that interface. So that can be injected as a dependency. Yeah. Let's see. Now you see we don't have to instantiate this class. MessageDO dot fetch message. You see in that method, I'm calling that fetch message method. So whatever it returns, we'll try to print it. Okay. You see, let me run this code. Now you got a message. DB welcome to Spring Framework. So that means the container is providing the messageDO bean reference. Otherwise, you see, if the container fails to inject the dependency, if it doesn't provide that messageDO bean reference, then what value will be stored in this reference variable? In the message to your reference variable, what will be the value which will be stored here? Yes, by default, what is the value which you'll have in that reference variable? You see, it will be null instance variables. Okay, this is an instance variable in this class, and it is reference variable. It's a reference variable. So by default, null will be stored. If that variable is not initialized, or if any value is not stored in that variable, so by default you'll have null reference itself. On the null reference, if you call the method, then what happens? You'll get null pointer exception. You'll get null pointer exception here. If the container fails to inject the dependency, only if the container fails to inject the dependency, then you'll get null pointer exception. Okay, so you see nowhere we have written the code to instantiate the variable, right? So is it clear for you people? All of you, can I have yes? What we did here? Very good. So now I have a very simple and straightforward question for you people. For suppose if I do this, instantiate the example service class and call that get message method. So what will be the output? So what error we will get? Okay. So why do people think we'll get an error here? So this time, yes, we're not asking the container to instantiate this bean. The container is not going to instantiate this bean. We are directly instantiating that bean, and you see, we are calling that method. So if we are directly instantiating the bean, then in that case, you see, the container will not be involved. That means it won't bother about managing the life cycle of the bean and all. Okay, so it won't bother about injecting the dependencies as well. So that means this time the dependency is not injected. So initializing the bean and all, it's your responsibility there. Let's run this code. We'll get null pointer exception. So is it clear for you people? Okay. So just give me a couple of minutes, please. I'm sorry. Just give me a couple of minutes. Yeah, I'm sorry. So I hope you understood that you see the container is supplying the dependency. That is one of the services which is provided by the container to the Spring Beans here. Yes. So what is the advantage of dependency injection? What is the advantage of dependency injection here? Okay, whatever you understood, tell me. What do you think? What could be the advantage here? Yes. No need of creating instance. Okay. See, in other words, I can say that one of the most common stuff which we do here in the Java programming is instantiating the classes, right? Creating objects, creating Java objects. You see, which is also a kind of boilerplate code, very redundant stuff, I can say. It is very much redundant. The most common tasks. Now you see that redundancy is avoided here, so we don't have to worry about writing the code to instantiate the beans and all. Now the container is taking care of it. I can say that is one of the advantages, of course. So what's next? What is the other advantage which you got here? You know, another important advantage of the Spring framework is, sorry, the dependency injection is, yes, we can, it helps us to develop the beans. Dependency injection will help us to develop the beans which are loosely coupled. Dependency injection will help us to develop the beans which are loosely coupled methods. So that is one of the advantages of using Spring framework, especially Spring framework's dependency injection, you can say. So it helps us to develop the beans which are loosely coupled. Did anyone try searching for these details? What is loose coupling here? What do we mean by beans which are loosely coupled? Yeah, which are more clean and readable. Okay. Yes, loose coupling. Interconnecting the components in the system. Okay. Let me give you people some notes which I have extracted from a very good book called as Spring in Action. Okay, regarding the loose coupling. Loose coupling. So basically, we can achieve this loose coupling between the beans through dependence injection. The elements are related. I got another answer. The elements are related to each other to least extent. That is also right exactly. Yes. You see, once again, let's try to help you people to understand this. So with the dependency injection, I'm just extracted this notes. Given DI means dependency injection here, okay? Given the dependencies at creation time by some third party that coordinates each object in the system. That is dependency injection again, because it is needed for me to explain it. So here we are talking about dependency injection. You're saying that okay, with dependency injection, objects are given their dependencies at creation time. That means when that object is created at that time, we'll supply the dependencies to that particular object. You see, who provides it? Some third party that coordinates each object in the system. So in our case, what is that third party which is providing the dependencies, which coordinates the objects in the system here? What is that third party which coordinates the objects in the system? Container. That's right. So in our example, you see, the container is responsible for that. It helps the beans to acquire the dependencies, and also you see it coordinates between the beans. You see, now it is making sure that one bean reference, it is supplied as a dependency, it is provided as a dependency to another bean here. It is provided as a dependency to another bean, right? Yes. Okay, good. So this point is clear for you people. Next, you see, here, what is the advantage of it? You will find that the dependent object means the object which uses the dependency. You know that, right? As a result of it, I can say that the dependent object isn't coupled to any specific implementation of the dependency. The dependent object isn't tightly coupled to any specific implementation of a dependency, I can say. Yes. So here, you see, what does that mean? This is a very important point. The key point is if the object or if the dependency or if an object, a note here, if an object only knows about its dependencies by their interface, then the dependency can be swapped out with a different implementation without the depending object knowing the difference. Okay, as of now, for time being, this point may look like a Greek, like Greek and Latin. Don't worry. Okay. First of all, please, all of you make a note of it and explain it. Don't worry. Let me know if you're done making a note of it. Okay. So, okay. Hope others are all have also made a note of it. Okay. So now let's check this one. As I told you people earlier also, one of the strategies, if you remember, if someone can just, read it out, one of the strategies which I told you people, which involves that interface, which has got interface. Just check that strategy once.
Hello?
Yes. Loose coupling
So,
through, yeah, tell me.
so one of the strategies you said was loose coupling through dependency injection and interface orientation.
Yes. Loose coupling through dependency injection and
Interface.
interface orientation. So, so this is one of the strategies here. Loose coupling can be achieved through interfaces. Dependency injection. Loose coupling can be achieved through dependency injection and interface orientation here. Dependency injection and interface orientation. Okay. So what does that mean? And even this point also stresses on the same thing. This one also says the same. So the dependency can be swapped out with a different implementation without a depending object knowing the differences. It says if an object only knows about its dependencies by their interface, if an object only knows about their dependencies through the interface, then the dependency can be swapped out with a different implementation without depending object knowing the differences. Okay, you know, I was already trying to achieve this here. If you can see this, example service has got a dependency that is message DO. Why message DO is a dependency for example service? Because message DO class here, you see, it helps, or that message DO bean helps the example service bean to fetch the messages from the database server. To fetch the messages from the database server, the example service bean is used here, right? So the example service bean uses message DO to fetch the messages from the database server. You know what? Here, example service, in the example service, we have to declare that message DO reference variable, right? But I didn't declare that message DO class reference variable here. Instead, I've declared a reference variable which is interface type here. I've declared a reference variable which is of that interface type. Why so? What is the advantage of that? I'll tell you just a second. So that why we have declared that reference variable here of interface type? Because you know, by doing this here, we are making sure that this bean is not aware of its implementation, the dependency implementation. It is not aware of it. I will say it is not aware of that implementation here. Which implementation? That message DO bean implementation is. It is not aware of that message DO bean implementation here. It only has got the reference to that interface. It only has got the reference to that interface. The actual bean class which implements that interface, that bean reference is not there here. And actually we are not using that bean class name at all here. So that means that is what the point says here. The object only knows about its dependency by their interface. Right? The object here, object only knows about the dependency by their interface. So if this is the case, then you see what is the advantage? Then the dependency can be swapped out with a different implementation without the dependent object knowing the difference. Without dependent object knowing the difference, we can swap it. Yes, that is what we can do. Okay. Yes. Okay. Why? Because you see, now I have a question for you people. Seriously think about it and answer this question. In this reference variable, in this message to your reference variable, which class object reference we can store? Which class object reference we can store here? In this message to your reference variable, which class object reference you can store? What do you people think? I want a right answer, exact answer. It is not that difficult. It is not that difficult for you people to answer this question. It's a very basic question. It's a very basic question, I can say, for you people. At this stage, it is a very basic question. I can say any class which implements this interface, any class which implements this interface, that class object reference can be stored here in this reference variable. Any class which implements this interface, okay, that class object reference can be stored here in this reference variable here. So hope you people got it, right? Any class which implements this interface, you'll find that that class object reference can be stored here. It need not be messaged to your class. Okay. So this is going to be an advantage here. So the example service will be using that implementations, that message to your bean interface implementations through the interface here. It uses that implementations here through the interface. Yep. So which helps us to easily swap the dependencies. It helps us to easily swap the dependencies here. So I'll give you a case where we need to do this. For suppose, let's say here we have this message to class, right? It has to interact with the database server. This message to bean class, it is supposed to interact with the database server. Now let's say this message to is using JDBC API for that purpose. Just assume that this class is using JDBC API to interact with the database server. Here, you handed over this code to your client. Your client is very happy with your code. They have started using it. After some time, okay, some time means maybe after some months or years, your client came back to you and said, look, JDBC has become little old, and moreover, JDBC has got some limitations, and they have got some new things which they wanted to add. They want you people to use Hibernate framework, let's say. They wanted you people to use Hibernate framework. Okay, the client came up to you and said that your client wants you to use Hibernate in the DO. The client wants you to use Hibernate in the DO. Okay, that means the DO is supposed to use Hibernate to interact with the database server. Okay, okay. So now what you are supposed to do now for this requirement? What exactly you are going to do? First of all, you understood this requirement. The client wants you people to use Hibernate in the DO instead of JDBC. So hope everyone got it, right? So what you will do? How will you fulfill your client's requirements? Will you change this DO class which you got here? Okay, but you won't use plain JDBC. But suppose if you want to fetch a record from the database server, so if you use JDBC, you have to establish the connection on your own, right? First of all, and then construct the query, create a statement object, execute the query. So these are all the things which you need to do. But suppose here, if using Hibernate, we'll use a session. Simply call the sessions get method. You don't have to worry about connection establishments and all such things, right? Even transformations also. Hope you got it. So what you do, I'll tell you. First of all, do not modify this existing DO in which you're using JDBC API. Okay? So you don't know when you may need this DO again. When you have any component which is working properly, do not make any changes to that component. You can retain it like that. Maybe you can reuse it somewhere. Use it somewhere else again. So now what I'll do is here, I will define another class called as message DO hib, and I'll make this class implements that interface again, iMessage DO interface, and you see I'll override that fetch message, implement that fetch message method. Let's say this time this method uses Hibernate, just as it. So message DO using Hibernate. Message DO hib is using Hibernate. Okay. So now we have this bean class, message DO bean, in which you got Hibernate to interact with the database server. Now we need to ask that example service bean, or sorry, you need to ask the container to supply this message DO bean, message DO hib, this new bean reference to the container. Sorry, to that example service bean. You need to ask the container to supply this message DO hib bean reference as a dependency to the example service. Okay, what to do? First of all, you have to configure this as a bean. You have to configure it as a bean here. Configure this class as a bean class. So to make it a spring bean. So how will you make it a spring bean here? You have to annotate this method with @component. Let's see. And configure an ID. So message DO hib. Now the container, I want the container to inject that message DO bean reference into that example service. So what exactly we need to do? What do people think? First of all, you understood this question, right? I want the container to inject that newly created bean message DO hib into that example service bean. So hope you people got it. So what to do? Okay, don't worry about the answer. First of all, is the question clear for you people? Can I have yes? Is the question clear? So it's important to understand the question first of all. What I said, is it clear? The question is not clear. You see, earlier this example service was using this message DO. That message DO bean, you see, this is the old message DO bean, which uses JDBC API. But our client wants the message DO to use Hibernate. So that's the reason why what we did here. We have developed a new bean, message DO hib, which uses Hibernate framework according to the client's requirement. So, but now I want to make sure that the example service bean, it uses this new bean message DO hib instead of message DO. That means if the example service has to use that new bean, first of all, the container is supposed to inject that message DO hib bean into this example service to supply that message DO hib in reference to the example service, right? So how can we make the container to inject that message DO hib bean instead of message DO? Now is it clear, all of you? Yeah, that is how. In the example service class, I'm not using any reference variables of type message DO class or message DO bean, right?
Use the message DO hib reference of interface type.
No, that will make the beans tightly coupled. So that we don't want to do that. Here, you see, without making any changes to this example service bean, so we should be able to supply or make the example service bean to use message DO. How? You see, we have configured this message DO here, right? So now I'll remove this component annotation. So what if I remove this component annotation? That means the container will not identify this bean as this. It won't identify it as a Spring Bean. The container will not identify this message DO as a Spring Bean, right? Container will not identify this message DO as a Spring Bean here. Yes. So now there is only one bean of that interface type, or which implements that interface, which one is the message DO. That's it. So now we have swapped the dependencies. We have switched the dependencies. The container will inject that message DO heap this time. That is the only bean class which implements that interface now. Okay, we got null pointer exception. I'm sorry. Okay, I have to remove this. Okay. Now you see, this time the example service bean uses message DO heap. So is it clear for everyone? So hope this is clear for everyone, right? So that means example service is not aware of that message DO implementations. So that message DO bean implementation class objects are supplied at runtime, the creation time, to the example service, which makes it loosely coupled. So we have a easy option to switch or make changes to the dependencies which are needed for the example service being here. So you got this point, all of you? We are able to easily swap or switch the dependencies here. We're able to easily swap or switch the dependencies. Yes. So this is the annotations version, but we'll also see XML version. You see, I can say that example service is loosely coupled with this message DO. For suppose here, instead of using the interface, earlier, what if I have used message DO as a reference variable type? If I use the class type, then what? In place of interface, if that reference variable type is a class type, then what happens? Then what is the issue? You will find that we have tightly coupled that example service to message DO. That means if you want to make changes, if you want this example service bean to use message DO heap, another bean, message DO heap, then you have to edit this code example service also, make changes to this example service heap. Then only you will be able to use that other bean here, right? Now without making any changes to this dependent bean, we are able to switch the dependencies. That is the advantage of using the loose coupling concept. Okay, which is achieved through dependency as well as interfaces. So let's stop it here today, and let's do one thing. We'll meet tomorrow and we'll continue our discussion. We have a class tomorrow at the same time. Okay? Thank you all. Bye bye.